Welcome to the Wisdom of Show. I'm your host, Simon Bowen, and every week I'm speaking to the world's greatest leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs about complex issues and impactful leadership. Join us in the Renaissance of Wisdom. Well, welcome to the Wisdom of Show. We live in an increasingly complex world, politically, socially, commercially, actually militarily, in every sense. And we're in an age where I think leadership is in question. Do we have great stewards leading the world? And in business, which really should be one of the greatest forces for good on the planet, are we stewarding our contribution to the world in the way that we should? We need people who are leaders of wisdom, these people who lead this renaissance of thinking, who challenge us to be better stewards, and who challenge us to make a greater contribution to the world. And as we unpack these complex issues, I have a wonderful guest for this episode, Marci Zaroff, and she has such a rich tapestry and history of entrepreneurial success and contribution. But I'm excited to have the conversation with her because she is a true steward. In 1995, she coined the term ECOfashion. And in 1995, that would have been well ahead of the curve. It's not something people would have been thinking about, right? A visionary, a guide, an innovator. Your book, ECOrenaissance, a lifestyle guide to co-creating a stylish, sexy, and sustainable world. It's a fantastic title. And the list goes on, but I don't want to take up episode time going through that. That bio is available in the show notes. What I really want to do is unpack with you, Marci, so many of the things that you think about really at two levels. At this level of let's be far more responsible, in your words, people, planet, profit, passion, and purpose. And then also, I'm sure as a serial entrepreneur that has built large companies and had large, sellouts of those companies, I'm sure you have some, bigger picture ideas that you would share with people that are either embarking or in the middle of, their entrepreneurial and business journey. So welcome to the show. Thank you so much for giving us the time. I really, really appreciate it. I'm excited about the conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
First of all, I'm kind of fascinated, right, that in 1995, you come up with this notion of eco-fashion, and we knew, we need to do a better job with the world, but 1995, it probably wasn't on everybody's, lips, if you like, as a term. And I'm interested in the trigger for that thought process and that initial journey to start to try to push this story.
Yeah, well, I would say a couple things. One is a girlfriend of mine gave me a book when I was still in my teens called Living in the Light by Shakti Gawain. And it struck a pretty deep chord in me, kind of with this premise that, there's so much more than what we see, right? And that sort of got me thinking to the point where I started on a personal level, diving into the environmental and social consciousness movement back in the day when it was defined as kind of a new age type of movement, metaphysics, organic food, crazy thought, right? So the first move that most people make when they start to become more conscious is they start thinking about their food, right? Well, what they're putting in their body makes a difference. And that's usually the gateway, just like in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Our first basic need is food. So my first chapter as an entrepreneur was in 1990. I co-founded a school that's known today as the Institute for Integrative Nutrition. It's the world's largest holistic health nutrition school. And that was just an extension of my own personal lifestyle, right? Where I was cooking healthy food and learning about, this is before people had heard of Whole Foods markets and kind of the natural organic movement. But there were those of us who sort of were diving into agriculture and learning about, the choices that we make and how they affect, our state of health and well-being. And that then led me through working, with consumers and other educators into this mindset that all of these different sectors that we choose every day as consumers and as business leaders are all interconnected. The same way that, we're connected to our environment, right? People forget that, and you think, oh, we live in the environment. We don't just live in the environment, we are the environment. We breathe
Mm,
out carbon, and nature breathes in carbon, and nature breathes out oxygen, and we breathe in oxygen. So
yeah.
we have this symbiotic relationship with nature, with our, global environment. And with that, I started to think bigger. And I was introduced to the founder of Aveda, which is a global personal care brand. And the founder, Horst, was also on the same wavelength as it relates to using a different modality to say the same stuff I was saying in food. And we then began to connect the dots of food and beauty. And that's when I had this epiphany that you can't really support one part of the equation without the others. And that's when I went down sort of the proverbial rabbit hole of, agriculture and food and fiber being connected, and recognizing that eco fashion was kind of the next step. Similar again, back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Our next basic need is shelter and clothing, that
Mm,
which protects us, right? That which goes on us, not just in us. And so the more I sort of, dove in and learned about the impacts of fashion and textiles, the more motivated and empowered I was to really drive the industry. And to your point, it was definitely perceived as crazy and out there, and people thought I was nuts, and because they're pretty dichotomous worlds, right? When you think about fashion, you think materialism, the way
yeah.
you look, right? It's very much about that sensory experience. Whereas when you think about the ecosystem, environment, it's more about social consciousness. It's about you know doing something bigger than you when you're thinking about protecting the environment. So bringing those worlds together was quite a journey. And I always say I wanted to style the world of change while changing the world of style, bridging the tree hugger and the fashionista and the tribe in the boardroom. So it's been a long and winding road, but
Yeah.
fortunately today everybody's waking up in my industry.
You would have been amongst the early challengers, as you said. People probably viewed you as that's a little strange, you know. And you weren't an old grey business person who's arguing decades of business experience. There must have been some challenges that you had to overcome to shift a whole bunch of people to some, really different ways of thinking. The challenge stories will be interesting. But what would be more interesting, I think, for people would be how you specifically tackled some of those things, both staying on course or even, how did you get people across the line on some of that early stage thinking, particularly to support the business?
Yeah, so there was an element of schizophrenia at the beginning because I was fusing two very different worlds, right?
Yeah.
So when you go to like a trade show in the fashion industry, back in the day, magic, coterie, and everybody was talking about, watch your back, right? Like you got to be careful. Everybody's out to copy each other and take from each other, and you can't trust anybody. And it was so foreign to me coming out of my roots in the organic and natural food industry, where there was a very different sentiment. It was more about, I've got your back. Companies that were the biggest of competitors in those early stages, especially, were collaborating and perceiving their work as cooperation, not competition,
Mm,
because they shared a vision. And so I had to, bring that sort of mindset into, this fashion and textile industry. And in doing that, going back to your point, there were a lot of challenges because I was bringing a different kind of languaging. But, you know, yes, there were many, many challenges, and the list goes on, but one of them was financial, raising money. I would be in a room of, for the most part, men in suits who would look at me cross-eyed when I would start talking about fashion. And then you want to layer on eco fashion, and they'd be like, whoa, like lost. There weren't enough women in the room to get fashion, first of all. And there weren't enough people who, understood the bigger vision, and they would think, oh, this is so niche. Nobody's ever going to buy into this. These are the tree hugger people, the crunchy frumpy, boxy beige granola. That was kind of the perception then on the food side, as well as certainly on the fiber side, right? Can you smoke it after you wear it? Is it a potato sack? So there was a lot of that there were a lot of stigmas that it was overpriced. You didn't know if it was real, and certainly it lacked everything that you want. So that really led me into kind of my life work, which has been leading with the philosophy of yes and, right? Leading with what do people really want? And in food, that's taste. And in beauty products, it's scent and functionality. And in fashion, it's style, quality, and price. And in business, it's profit, right? It's
Mm.
profitability. So you have to be leading with, you know, those kind of core attributes. And then looking at the sustainability, the, social consciousness, the fair trade and low impact, all that yummy stuff that is really the DNA of my work. That's the value add. So it's not this or that, it's this and that. You're getting more. This isn't about sacrifice and deprivation. So there were a lot of years of me having to sort of pound the pavement, and I've got the bruises to show for it. It's a little bit of a walking cliche, what doesn't kill you makes you smarter, stronger, better, clearer, right? But, I was persistent and tenacious, kind of the classic qualities of a good entrepreneur, right?
Yeah.
Passion and conviction. And so I believed it. I've never wavered for a moment in time in my entire 30 plus year career of believing that this is the right thing. It's just a function of how do you package it and lead with that, that visceral design experience, right? The sensory experience, and
Yeah.
then bring people down that rabbit hole.
And you've semi-answered the question I was going to lean to based on what you said before, when you said, then I realize it's both sides of the equation. And looking at things as an equation is often an interesting way of viewing things. And yes, and is both sides of an equation. Yes, you should have all of those things because they're high in your priority, and we should be able to do it in a better way, as opposed to, yes, but. So you can have those things, but there's a price to pay, or
That's
we
right.
don't want to pay the price, so you can't have that. So, that equation is kind of interesting. So you're not, and you clearly said it's not deprivation. That's a pretty key thing. If a young emerging entrepreneur is thinking about this, listening to this, right? How can you craft what you want to take to the world in a way that it doesn't require someone to sacrifice for the success and the things that you want to create, and adds to it? It's almost the definition of stewardship. Take the gifts you've been given and return them with increase, make a greater contribution. So you've been very involved in the global organic textile standards and the fair trade textile certification. And I mean, they're both, they're well understood. No, I wouldn't say they're well understood, but people know of them. People in the space would understand them well. But I'm really interested in your involvement in that, and this idea of worldwide responsibility, almost certifications. It's a really fascinating space to be playing in. I'd love if you could unpack
Yeah,
that a little bit.
sure. Well, everybody now talks about uh, collaboration, right? Everybody talks about transparency. It's kind of
Yeah.
like these are some of those key terms now in business that people take for granted because everyone's saying it. But back when I was like really building, this movement and my career, those fundamental tenets of business, of good business, were were sort of two buckets. One is if you want people to really buy into something, from a value add perspective, you have to demonstrate that it actually is adding value. And that's where transparency and traceability come in, which, people can make claims, but if you can't back them up, what good are they? Right. And greenwashing became very prevalent when this whole kind of sustainability movement started because people were defining, what's good and what's sustainable in a billion different ways. And it got very blurry. Right. So the development of standards like the GOTS standard, the Global Organic Textile Standard, or the Fair Trade Textile Standard, or the Textile Exchange, with which I was one of the co-founders, and we also have 8 standards, which are now rolling up into something called Materials Matter. These are all ways for us to actually embed accountability into those claims, where we can monitor every touch point of a supply chain from beginning to end, allowing for that, that traceability or transparency at the same time that, when you're providing the end product, right, you have a seal that consumers begin to trust because these standards have third party certification bodies, right? So these are outsiders that come in and audit the process and put that seal of approval on it. The GOT standard is the highest standard for an organic textile. And the reason we developed that is when you think about an organic food product, right? And you go and you buy, organic food in many different countries around the world, and you see the seal, the NOP organic seal that comes out of the US Department of Agriculture, the USDA, and we have equivalencies all over the world. You recognize it, you trust it, there's a process behind it, there's a federal regulation behind it. And so you're more inclined to say, okay, if this is really organic, now I understand how that's going to be better for me. But I also want something that I like, tastes good and so on, right? So the having those seals is a way to validate the claim. But we couldn't use the USDA organic seal on textiles because all the allowances that kind of the exceptions are food specific. So we developed the Global Organic Textile Standard in the US to start as our fiber standard to mirror the food standard. And then we discovered that the UK and the Soil Association did the same thing. And in Japan, they did the same thing. And in Germany, they did the same thing. Well, we all know textiles cross country borders and boundaries every day. These brands that we're all buying around the world are global, global fashion houses. And so we need a uniform standard. So probably one of the most exciting collaborations that also fuels traceability that I've ever been involved in was the development of the GOT standard, because it literally was those 4 countries, the trade organizations coming together to birth a global standard that we all signed up for. And today there's over 15,000 certified, GOTS entities. And it is the platinum standard from farm or seed all the way to shelf, to finished product, to, packaging even. Everything is the highest standard of, it's post-consumer recycled packaging, no harmful finishes or dyes. So there's no chlorine bleach, formaldehyde, heavy metals, low acetone, optical brighteners, but it's all at least 70% certified organic materials or fibers. So that's the GOT standard. You talked about the fair trade standard. I mean, stating the obvious, took 7 years to build that, really to look at, how can we make sure that for the most part, the people that are making the product are actually being paid fairly, that they have safe working conditions. There's no child labor. I mean, these are really big issues in the fashion textile industry. And Rana Plaza, which happened in Bangladesh in 2012, when 1,133 people lost their lives, mostly women, in literally a single moment because a factory collapsed, really woke the world up around, business as usual can't continue in the fashion textile industry globally. Between the social and environmental impacts, it's a pretty exploitive and pretty toxic industry. It's actually the second largest polluter next to coal, the fashion and textile industry.
A term that I just think is fundamentally in error is the term, well, it's just business. Because it's never just business. It's always about people. It's always about the planet we live on. Business affects everything. And I think free enterprise has as much responsibility, if not more, in the world than government, because it reaches every corner. It crosses boundaries and borders, and it reaches into homes every single day. And for a lot of people, I want to start a business and I want to make money. But you've taken on hard things to do that on the surface might not be directly connected to profit. But I suspect being the driving force of global standards in your industries was great for business as well in many ways. I'd love to kind of explore the connection between being one of these visionaries and innovators in let's get some global practices in place, let's clean this up. How did that then play into business success and your entrepreneurial pursuits and success?
Yeah, so I would say that it used to be about staying ahead. right? Like it was a competitive advantage to
Yeah.
be able to have an added value equation on top of, being able to offer what everybody else is offering. In my case, in fashion, style, quality, fit, color, price, comfort, right? And oh, by the way, it's also ethically made, regenerative, circular, fair trade, low impact, all of that yummy stuff, you know, would put you kind of ahead of everyone else. Well, as more people woke up, as the education, got out there, as company organizations like Textile Exchange began to accelerate the membership, we started to see this no longer about staying ahead, but about not being left behind. A little
Yeah.
bit of that kind of FOMO, right? That cool factor, because again, it goes back to how do we package this where if you're not part of it, you're outside of it. And as Albert Einstein once said, we can't solve today's problems with the same consciousness that created those problems.
Mm.
And I think as consumers, as parents, as citizens of the planet, you'd be pretty asleep if you're not seeing the rise of natural disasters, how climate is changing, how cancer rates are rising, how degenerative illnesses are proliferating. Like, I think people are becoming more and more aware. In fact, COVID, the greatest gift that the pandemic gave us globally, was an awakening that if you don't have your health, what do you have, right? We couldn't go outside, so we had to go inside, and going inside also meant resetting our priorities and recognizing how important your state of health and well-being, your family, your home, how important these things that we might have taken for granted actually are, right? And so I think people started to reprioritize. And that has, kind of given people this sort of renewed thinking around business too, especially younger generations who don't want to just sign up for that same old, same old. So there's this domino effect, because then the corporations are like, well, how do we stay relevant to this new generation of thinking, to this new consciousness that's, starting to pervade the mainstream mentality? And you look at organic food, as an example of that. It's gone from, where Whole Foods was the big player to, in the US, Costco is the biggest buyer of organic food in America, right? You've got
Mm.
83% of Americans buying organic food now, at least occasionally. Why? Because it's accessible. It's simple supply and demand, right? It's out there more. It's more affordable. And so as we start to think about, business as it relates to sustainability and the elevation of consciousness, you start to realize that, this is no longer a choice. It's an imperative. If you're not embedding social and environmental accountability into your business practices, into your strategies, it's just a matter of time, but you'll be out of the game. And
Yeah.
that kind of 5 Ps that you mentioned, the quintuple bottom line, that I've been talking about for the last, 15, 20 plus years, is really about, looking at business and good business beyond just your bottom line. Of course, profit and prosperity are key, but people, planet, passion, and purpose are equally important. And that's why the B Corp, movement has just exploded globally, right? Because that form of governance that sort of taps people into, there's more than just the bottom line, because we have to think about risk. We have to think about, our corporate risk, our brand and reputational risk, and then ultimately, how do we, as I said, stay relevant to, the evolution of the consumer?
Yeah. So, companies have gone through this journey over, several decades. The purpose-driven company. I still vividly remember, in the late 80s and 90s, vision and mission, but you could walk into a boardroom and ask people what the vision is, and no one could tell you without checking, the thing on the wall or whatever. And then, we do social good. Yes, we sponsor this orphanage, or, as opposed to, was it really integrated into the DNA of the business? And so really making social innovation and making social contribution and change and sustainability an integrated piece of the business model is clearly, what you've done, and then extended it to the broader business model for many others through various certifications and standards and things like that. I'd love to explore some of the pragmatic thought processes that leaders of a business that really does have integrated social innovation as a part of the business model might think through, in the boardroom, in the executive room, you're going to launch a new product into the marketplace. It, it might be so embedded in your DNA that it's not a separate thought process. But if someone's running a company, a manufacturing business or something like that, and it isn't something they've consciously paid attention to, and you've rattled off a bunch of things, your reputation, what is your compliance risk, and what's your market risk, where does someone start who hasn't been doing this, but they really want to see their business be that integrated with this kind of change and this kind of focus? Where do they even start that thought process?
Okay, so I think first on a personal level, I mean, you can see that, there is an increase in sort of social justice and climate justice and, environmental awareness. These are all, inextricably interconnected, these kind of ideas around, right? That being sort of the starting point, right? And as
Yes.
Jonathan Swift once said, vision is the art of seeing things invisible. So if you start there and then you think about how do I not just do less harm, but actually do more good? Obviously, and anyone who, creates a business pitch deck for, is already aware that you want to define the problem in order to identify the solution that you're going after, right? Because if you're not a part of the solution, you're a part of the problem, right? So then you can start to like build from there and think about, okay, how do I think out of the box, but with these principles, in just as part of the DNA, right? And thinking every step of the way with every choice you're making, how is that going to do more good? And I would backtrack for a moment, kind of addressing something that you said when you were leading into this, which, there was this kind of redemption mindset in like the earlier years, right? The leaders of yesterday, where it was like, I'm going to make as much money as I can. And then I'm going to sell my company. And then I'm going to be a philanthropist and I'm going to give back to all these good causes to kind of alleviate the guilt of all the destruction and degradation and, that I might have done in my business career, right? So I think that, the younger generations, I think, are getting wind to that their future is a lot closer. It feels more threatened than the future that maybe the generation before them, my generation, right? Like I never was thinking about like, will there be a future? I was planning my future kind of, with where I believe each chapter will lead me. I never in my career heard more than I hear now the younger generation saying
Yeah.
things like, I don't know if I want to have children because I don't know if I want to bring children into this world. That's pretty scary. And I have never heard that in all the decades of being in business because it's real. I mean, when you start to see the political, economic, environmental, challenges that these kids today are navigating, not to mention, of course, all the overwhelming, the blessing and the curse of the digital era. It's pretty crazy out there today, right? And like, what's going to change that? So I think there is such a hunger for positivity. There's such a hunger for solutions. There's such a thirst for good, something to hang your hat on that's good. I mean, it's even in social media. The social media mafia can be your best friend or your worst enemy. And if you're not doing things right today, you're kind of in the line of fire too, right? Because there's a lot of anger and hostility. It's like we're living in this modern day Star Wars of, those who are trying to turn on the light and kind of transform culture. And then there's those hanging on to the old school, old systems in the dark and all that like anger and kind of, and those worlds are sort of colliding now and it's a little bit of that sort of polarity that is also creating a little chaos. So I think, when we start to talk about business as a force for good, it's about bringing people into something much bigger that is not just about the product, the shirt, the jacket, the food product, the beauty product, the whatever it is that you're creating. It's about, what does that represent? What's in it? What is the impact of it? You have the whole farm to table movement was really this kind of mindset around going back to the source. And when I talk about, COVID and that awakening going inside, it's about going back to our own source and asking, right? Because we have that wisdom deep down, right? In sort of the gut of who we are. The lifeline to gut is truth, right? And so when you start to think about the source of our products and why there's now this kind of new way of thinking around, like, what's in my food, where is it being grown, how's it being grown? And in the world of fashion, the fashion revolution movement was all about who made my clothes, what's in it, where is it being made, how's it being made? And that those questions, when you can pull the curtain back and unveil those impacts by going online and just Googling. The internet's changed the game. And that, I think, is why we have to be thinking differently about the ingredients of business, right? Not just the products, not the end game, but also sort of what's in the, and I might just say it's love, right? On some level, right? I mean, one of my favorite quotes is from a book called The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, which the quote that really just stands out is work is love made visible. When you love your work, it's not just work, it's love. Every day you're empowered and inspired and excited and then engaging and that's the energy I think these new generations are seeking, right? And so it's an exciting time. And I think sustainability doesn't have to be packaged as dark and scary and overwhelming and daunting and hard but instead, like, this is a new chapter. It's exciting. It's like we're going through this, think of like, a caterpillar kind of becoming a butterfly. We're going through a transformation. That's what my book is all about, right? This eco-renaissance, this rebirth of humanity through this like awakening that we're all part of an ecosystem, a collective global ecosystem, sharing a home, sharing a future. It's like that movie, Don't Look Up. We're not, different, even though there might be this kind of, dark and light energy at odds. We all are sharing the same home, right? So at the end of the day, we have to find a common, unified way we see our future. Otherwise, we all go down.
Yeah, well, there's so many interesting things that you've just unpacked. And, work is, what did you say? Work is love
Work
made
is
visible,
love made visible.
made visible, right? And, just from a leadership point of view, if you're a company leader, a fair question would be, have we created an environment here where people love their work? But we also know the stats that an overwhelming number of people hate their job, hate their work, are disengaged. They're not volunteers in the process. So, was an older way of delivering, businesses and companies better? Arguably not. And you clearly, uh, you know, have an energy of all in once you've identified something that you're going for. And across multiple brands and companies, you're a serial entrepreneur, farm to home and seed to style, YesAnd brand, the eco fashion and ECOrenaissance movement, multiple times author. You would have some wisdom to share with young entrepreneurs and leaders, business type wisdom. Let's step into, if you were sharing 3 to 5, if you're taking a young entrepreneur, you could see the potential that they could change the world in the way that you did, in their laneway, in what they were going to do. And you were going to unpack 3 to 5. This is the most important stuff I'd want to share with you. And I know this question's without notice, so I'm not giving you much time to think about it. But what might those pearls of wisdom be that you would give that young person? Say, just remember this, keep thinking this. What would you share with them?
Okay, so I think the first one might be whatever you think is going to happen, it's not. It's going to happen totally differently. So just like life, in business, put your seatbelt on, throw your arms up, get on the ride, and enjoy the ride. It's not just about the destination, it's about the journey. And of course, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step, right? Lao Tzu. So it's about, know how and when to pivot and be comfortable and okay with shifting gears, because that's how you're going to grow and get better, right? And then the second, which I think is kind of connected to that, is what you may perceive as challenges or roadblocks are actually opportunities. Because when you hit those walls, and remember, we're just made of energy, everything is energy, right? So, law of existence, right? In physics. So, if you start to think of energy wants to flow. So, when I talk about pivoting and then you talk about hitting perceived walls, you want to figure out how to navigate. And those are the moments where you get challenged, not challenged that's going to stop you, but challenged where it makes you think and go deeper, right? And that becomes an opportunity to get better. And so welcome those, perceived walls so that you are challenged, and don't try to force a square peg in a round hole. And then I would say, thirdly, in my work, which, we've kind of touched on, I believe that you have to teach by example. You can't teach by preaching. It's about walking your talk and inspiring while you're teaching. And, whether it's as a parent, I have 5 kids, I mean, 2 birth kids, 3 stepkids. But for me, I mean, my people used to tell me when they were younger, oh, they're all going to rebel. And I said, no, they're not, because it's about, you never dictate, right? And I think the old world of business was very much about talking at people, instead of with people, instead of engaging. That's why advertising has shifted, and it's more about social media and digital media, because old school, like, ads don't work the way they did. It's more about what are your friends like, and what are they doing, and the people you trust, right? So I think establishing trust and credibility and authenticity is just as important as transparency and traceability and being accountable. And so authenticity comes from being real. And so keep it real. I think that's like something that the younger generations actually are waking up to on a lot of levels, and it's all integrated here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually did have a question about authenticity. It reads through on kind of everything you do. Do you have any practices as a business leader that you've consciously adopted or created specifically for people to see the authenticity of both you, but also, hey, here's the change we're trying to be and we're trying to create. Here's what we're trying to bring to the world. Do you have any specific things you're consciously doing so that people really do see the authenticity? And I don't mean in an artificial way. It's just
Yeah.
conscious of it.
Yeah. Well, I think, so much is about meeting, consumers and corporates where they are, whether I'm working B2B or I'm working, B2C. In my work, it's about meeting people where they are, not imposing a certain way they should be, but recognizing that there's a spectrum, right? And that spectrum is no different than the spectrum of nature, where you can throw a million seeds into a garden, in a bunch of soil, and they're all going to bud at different times, right? So it doesn't make any one plant less important than the next. They're just in a different place. And I look at, humanity that way, right? Like, we're all just seeds in a garden that are all budding and growing and then ultimately dying, and, new seeds, new life, right? So it's about, cultivating, right? Watering. And that's the way I look at, my relationships in business is, whether I'm on a stage with thousands of people in a public speaking, keynote event, or I'm writing my book, or I'm talking on a webinar, or I'm just one-on-one with people in my team, on my team. It's just about speaking from your heart and your soul, and not being so contrived around, like what you're supposed to say and do. I think there's something very fluid and very, when you're, I said about being real comes from the gut, it comes from like when you're just channeling how you feel. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't have disciplines in what you say and how you act. Obviously, they're filtering what you do with in a respectful and professional way is important. But I think people feel passion. And that's why when I talk about good business, passion is just as important as profitability, because that is the fuel that ultimately comes from love,
Mm.
right? And when I interview people for my companies, I always say, if you could write your own job description, what would that be? Right? Because I want you to be in a role that you're so excited you can't wait to wake up in the morning. And I've been doing this work for over 3 decades. And I always say sometimes I feel like a little kid in a candy store because I get to do what I love. I get to make a great living and change the world at the same time. Like, sign me up for that. And I think if you can sort of apply that mindset, for and inspire business leaders of tomorrow to think like that, then they'll be a little more discerning around kind of not trying to force themselves into a situation that doesn't feel right, but to trust their gut. And likewise for business leaders and corporate executives who are hiring, surround yourself with people who are very connected to that work that you are assigning them to do, because that's how you're going to get the efficiency, the productivity, and the passion in collective success, right? The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So you want to channel people into things that they love and that they're excited to do. And the minute they feel like they're just going through the motions and they don't like what they're doing, I promise you it's probably not going to work. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, it's almost a diametrically opposite perspective to the Industrial Revolution and Taylorism and, compartmentalizing bits of a job, and someone stands at the production line and sprays blue paint on the badge and hands it to the next person who sprays red. And, that's what you do, fit in that hole. And that's it. That's the aspiration of your career, as opposed to people feel passion. I love that line. And if you can connect people to something they're passionate about, you must automatically get a high level of engagement from them. So,
Definitely.
look, I could listen to you all day talking about what you've done, and of course, Marci, the proof is in the results and what you've achieved, not only in terms of business, but in terms of getting an entire global movement, being a key player in things like certifications and standards across food and fiber and textile and things like that. So the proof is in the results. Just before we wrap up, I'd love to ask a couple of questions so people can know a little bit more about Marci underneath that. They're kind of fun, quick response questions, two or three of them. If there's one pure moment of joy in your life that you just really remember, what would that be, and why was that so joyful for you?
I mean, I guess I'd have to say birthing my daughter. Um, just there are no words to express and I home birthed her. So natural childbirth, and just the profound experience of creating life was just, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
smiles all on every cell.
You don't have to explain that one any further, right? You're not,
Exactly.
you're not going to say, well, when my business hit X million in revenue. No, not even
No.
close.
And my son equally as exciting. I mean, just and listen, that's part of why I do the work that I do, right? Because it's my responsibility, as Native Americans say, and there's wisdom from Native Americans, that we don't inherit this land from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children,
Yeah.
right? So we have a responsibility as business leaders and citizens of this planet to take care of our home.
And that is the definition of this concept of stewardship. We don't own it.
Yes,
We're
that's right.
caretakers and we pass it
That's
on.
right.
Is there a song that that has almost been the rhythm of your life, a song that really has you've always connected to, that is representative of you and almost everything you've done and what you stand for?
I mean, the first thing that just popped in my head is probably Imagine by John Lennon,
Right.
because it's so moving, because when you feel the song and you feel the words, and I'm the eternal optimist. I like, it makes me melt just thinking about, like, if just everyone in the world could hold hands and live in peace and all be aligned on, creating a thriving, cleaner, greener, global community for everybody. We all
Yeah.
win. Like, Yeah,
And it shouldn't be that hard. It shouldn't be that difficult that it's almost seen as what if we could? Imagine if
exactly.
we could. It should be why aren't we doing it? And so, Marci, on
Exactly.
that, I really want to thank you for giving us generously of your time today. I want to challenge everybody in business to just think carefully about the conversation of this episode, that uh, being greater contributors, being better stewards of what we've been gifted to look after, isn't a bolt-on to business as a marketing tool. It should be an integrated way of thinking and operating in the business. And by default, it creates a different level of business success because the world is actually demanding it these days. And future generations will demand it even more than we are currently. And so, how do you influence your industry? How do you influence global standards and expectations around what your company does? How do you influence the authenticity and the passion inside your own business? And how can you make sure your business contributes to that quintuple bottom line of people, planet, profit, passion, and purpose? So, Marci, thank you so much for the time you've given us. I really, really appreciate it. And, I'm sold. I'm in. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Onward and upward, as I say, to a green, chic, and healthy planet.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for having me. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.